Long before the galaxy learned to speak the language of empires and rebellions, before banners were raised and anthems composed, there existed only silence. And within that silence, a question that would echo across millennia. It was a question not of light, but of imbalance. Not of peace, but of endurance. History would later give this question a name, though names are often poor substitutes for understanding. It would call it the Sith. To study the Sith Order is not merely to recount a lineage of tyrants or to catalogue the crimes of fallen individuals. It is instead an examination of a philosophy that arose in response to fear, limitation, and the quiet resentment that follows power denied. Where the Jedi sought harmony through detachment, the Sith turned inward, discovering that emotion, when cultivated rather than suppressed, it could become a tool sharper than any blade. This divergence did not happen in a moment of violence, but in contemplation, in exile, and in long nights spent questioning doctrines that promised balance, yet delivered restraint. What follows is not a story of heroes and villains in the familiar sense. It is a historical record of choices made slowly, often reluctantly, and justified with careful logic. The Sith did not see themselves as monsters. They saw themselves as realists. To them, the galaxy was not a place that could be trusted to remain stable without force applied deliberately and without apology. Order, they believed, was not born from consensus, but imposed by will. Across thousands of years, this belief would be refined, broken, reassembled and distilled. Empires would rise bearing the unmistakable mark of Sith philosophy, must then collapse under the weight of their own certainty. Masters would train apprentices not out of generosity, but necessity, knowing that betrayal was not a flaw in the system, but its final examination. Knowledge would be hidden, encoded, and passed down like a fragile relic, always at risk of extinction, yet somehow enduring. By the time the galaxy encountered the Sith openly, their long preparation was already complete. What appeared sudden was, in truth, the final movement of a symphony composed in secrecy. The fall of the Republic, the rise of the Empire, and the reshaping of galactic history were not acts of chaos, but of patience. The Sith had learned to wait. This account does not seek to glorify their triumphs, nor to soften their atrocities. It seeks only to understand how a single schism in an ancient order could ripple outward, shaping centuries of conflict and silence alike. To understand the Sith is to accept that history is not driven solely by hope, but by those who are willing to endure its absence. This is the complete history of the Sith Order, from its first fracture to its quiet dominion over the stars, set against the distant backdrop of the saga known to us through Star Wars, Episode 4, A New Hope, though its roots reach far deeper than that familiar beginning. In the earliest records preserved by the Order, there is no mention of darkness as an adversary. There is only imbalance, described not as an enemy to be destroyed, but as a condition to be corrected through understanding. These records, fragmentary and often translated through generations of careful revision, speak of an era when the galaxy was perceived as a single breathing system, bound together by an energy field that defied ownership or alignment. This field would later be named the Force, though in this age it was understood less as a power and more as a presence, something felt rather than wielded. The community that arose around this understanding would eventually be known as the Jedi Order. Though its earliest incarnation bore little resemblance to the institution remembered in later centuries. There were no towering councils, no rigid codes etched into stone. Instead, there were enclaves of thinkers, healers, and scholars who believed that sensitivity to the Force carried an obligation toward restraint. To feel deeply was not, in their view, a license to act freely, but a responsibility to act carefully. Unity, in this context, did not mean uniformity. The early Jedi did not suppress emotion entirely, nor did they deny the natural impulses that arose from fear, love, or ambition. What they sought instead was distance. Emotion was to be observed, acknowledged, and then released, like a breath exhaled before it could become a storm. Attachment, they believed, narrowed perception. Desire introduced bias. Anger distorted judgment. These were not moral failings, but practical dangers. For a time, this philosophy served them well. The Force responded predictably to calm intention, and the Jedi became respected mediators across developing systems. Their ability to perceive conflict before it erupted, to sense suffering before it became visible, granted them an aura of quiet authority. They were invited rather than imposed, trusted rather than feared. In this age, the Jedi were not warriors, but custodians of balance. And balance was understood as the absence of extremes. Yet, even in this period of relative harmony, contradictions took root. The Jedi taught that the Force was universal, belonging to all life equally, yet only a few were trained to commune with it deeply. They spoke of detachment, yet lived apart from the wider galaxy, forming an insulated culture that interpreted reality through its own discipline. Over time, where what began as guidance hardened into doctrine, practices once debated became prescribed. Reflection slowly gave way to instruction. Some among the Jedi began to notice these shifts, not as safeguards, but as limitations. These individuals were not reckless or inherently malicious. On the contrary, many were among the most intellectually curious members of the Order. They questioned whether emotional suppression truly led to clarity, or whether it merely redirected emotion into subtler, more dangerous forms. They observed that fear, when denied, did not disappear, but instead manifested as anxiety over loss. That attachment, when forbidden, transformed into guilt rather than freedom. They asked, quietly at first, whether the Jedi pursuit of balance had begun to resemble avoidance. The Force itself seemed to complicate these questions. It did not respond uniformly to detachment. In moments of intense emotion, grief, desperation, resolve, it surged with undeniable potency. Those who touched it in such moments often reported heightened awareness, not confusion. The Jedi Council, cautious by nature, interpreted these reports as warnings. Power gained too quickly, they argued, carried unseen costs. History, even then, offered examples of civilizations undone by excess. Still, the debate persisted. The concept of balance became the axis upon which disagreement turned. For the Orthodox Jedi, balance meant neutrality between extremes, a stillness that prevented domination by any single impulse. For the dissenters, balance implied totality. Light and shadow, they argued, were not opposing forces, but complementary aspects of a greater whole. To deny one was to misunderstand the other. This philosophical divergence did not immediately fracture the Order. For years, it existed as an undercurrent, expressed through private discourse and carefully worded texts. The Jedi valued harmony above consensus, and disagreement, so long as it remained theoretical, was tolerated. But theory has a tendency to seek practice. As some Jedi began to experiment with techniques that drew deliberately on strong emotion, the Council's concern deepened. These practices were not violent, nor overtly corruptive, but they represented a departure from established discipline. The Force, when approached through passion rather than serenity, behaved differently. It answered more readily. It shaped itself to will rather than intention. And to those who experienced this responsiveness, the implications were difficult to ignore. Power, they realized, was not inherently chaotic. It was directional. The Council responded by formalizing prohibitions that had previously been informal. Certain texts were restricted. Certain meditative paths were discouraged. The language of guidance shifted subtly toward enforcement. What had once been a shared pursuit of understanding became, for some, an act of obedience. This was the moment when unity began to strain. The dissenters did not yet call themselves Sith. They did not see themselves as founders of an opposing order. They believed sincerely that they were preserving the original spirit of inquiry that had defined the Jedi's earliest days. From their perspective, it was the Council that had drifted, it mistaking control for balance and stillness for wisdom. The Force, impartial and unjudging, offered no resolution. As tensions grew, mediation was attempted. Councils were convened. Compromises proposed. But philosophy, when rooted in fundamentally different assumptions about human nature, rarely yields easily. One side believed that peace required the management of emotion. The other believed that peace required its mastery. The eventual break did not come through violence, but through decision. A ruling was made, declaring certain practices not merely dangerous, but incompatible with Jedi identity. Those who refused to abandon them were asked to leave. Exile, framed as preservation of harmony, was chosen over internal fracture. And so, quietly, without war or spectacle, the age of unity ended. Those who departed carried with them more than resentment. They carried questions that had been left unanswered, and a belief that the Force itself had more to offer than the Jedi were willing to accept. In time, these questions would harden into doctrine, belief would sharpen into certainty, and the galaxy would come to know the consequences of a philosophy born not from hatred, but from disagreement. The Sith, though not yet named, had already begun. Exile, when recorded by institutions, is often described as an administrative necessity, a measured response to irreconcilable difference. When lived, it is something quieter and far more enduring. For those who are asked to leave the Jedi enclaves, the moment did not arrive with ceremony. There were no trials meant to humiliate, no public denunciations meant to erase their names. There was simply a closing of doors, both literal and philosophical, and the understanding that the path they wished to walk would no longer be supported by the order they had once served. They departed not as conquerors, but as scholars, burdened with certainty. The galaxy beyond the Jedi worlds was vast and largely indifferent to internal disputes of Force traditions. For a time, The exiles moved as itinerants, gathering in small circles, as sharing techniques and texts that had been deemed unsafe or unnecessary by the council. In these early years, their identity was fluid. They referred to themselves not as an order, but as seekers, united less by loyalty to one another than by a shared dissatisfaction with restraint. What bound them together was not anger, but resolve. Yet separation has a way of clarifying belief. Freed from the expectation of balance as defined by the Jedi, these exiles began to test the limits of emotional engagement with the Force. Anger was not indulged indiscriminately, but studied. Fear was not rejected, but traced to its origin and shaped into vigilance. Desire, rather than being denied, was interrogated for its motivational power. They observed that the Force, when approached through intensity rather than calm, responded not with chaos, but with precision. This discovery did not feel like corruption. It felt like revelation, where the Jedi emphasized surrender to the will of the Force. The exiles explored assertion. They did not ask what the Force desired of them. They asked what it could be made to do. This distinction, subtle in language, proved profound in consequence. Power ceased to be something borrowed temporarily and became something cultivated deliberately. Over time, this philosophical shift demanded structure. Without the unifying discipline of the Jedi Code, disagreements among the exiles intensified. Not all emotions yielded the same clarity. Some practitioners found themselves consumed by impulses they had believed they could master. Others pursued control with an almost ascetic rigor, convinced that emotion, like any tool, could be sharpened without cutting the hand that wielded it. Survival required hierarchy, and hierarchy required doctrine. It was during this period that the schism became permanent. The exiles' relationship with the Jedi deteriorated not through direct confrontation, but through mutual recognition that reconciliation was no longer possible. The Jedi Council began to record these individuals not as dissenters, but as threats, warning initiates that emotion-driven practices led inevitably to domination and collapse. The exiles, in turn, came to view the Jedi not as misguided allies, but as custodians of stagnation, enforcing a vision of balance that denied growth. Language hardened on both sides. The final break, remembered later as the first schism, was marked by violence, though accounts differ on its scale. Skirmishes occurred when Jedi sought to retrieve or destroy forbidden texts. Confrontations arose when exiles refused to abandon systems where they had established followings. These were not wars in the conventional sense, but they introduced a reality that neither side could ignore. Philosophy, once abstract, had acquired physical consequence. Driven from the core world, the exiles ventured into regions of space poorly mapped and rarely governed. It was here, on a harsh, red-hued world steeped in the dark resonance of the Force, that their transformation accelerated. This planet, later known to the galaxy as Korriban, was not discovered by chance. It called to them, responding to their presence with an intensity that felt both welcoming and dangerous. And Korriban was already inhabited by a species deeply attuned to the darker currents of the Force. These beings, later referred to as the Sith, possessed a culture that valued strength, lineage, and dominance as virtues rather than moral failings. Their understanding of power was instinctive, woven into ritual and social structure. Conflict was not something to be resolved, but something to be survived. And through survival, identity was forged. The meeting between the exiles and the native Sith was not immediately harmonious. There were battles born of mutual suspicion and incompatible hierarchies. Yet over time, a synthesis emerged. The exiles brought with them disciplined force techniques, refined through years of Jedi training. The Sith offered a worldview unburdened by guilt over ambition or conquest. What resulted was not assimilation, but transformation. Philosophy became culture. Practice became tradition. It was here that the term Sith began to lose its specificity. Originally denoting a people, it came to represent an ideology shaped by the fusion of exile philosophy and native custom. The Sith came to believe that conflict was the engine of progress, that suffering was not an aberration but a crucible, and that power justified itself through endurance. The Force, in this framework, was not a moral guide, but a resource to be claimed by those willing to pay its price. Central to this emerging identity was the concept of the master and the apprentice. Learning was no longer communal. Knowledge was transmitted selectively, often guarded jealously. To teach was to risk being surpassed. To learn was to accept eventual confrontation. This dynamic was not viewed as cruelty, but as honesty. If an apprentice could not overcome the master, then the master deserved to remain. If the apprentice succeeded, then the lineage grew stronger. One of the earliest figures to embody this transition was Ajunta Pol, remembered in later Sith texts as both philosopher and conqueror. Once a Jedi Knight, Paul embraced the emotional path not out of rage, but out of conviction. Then he argued that the Jedi's fear of the dark was itself a form of weakness, and that true mastery required the integration of all aspects of the self. His writings, fragmented though they are, reflect a mind preoccupied not with domination for its own sake, but with permanence. Yet even in these formative years, seeds of future instability were sown. The Sith belief in strength bred constant internal tension. Alliances shifted. Betrayals occurred not as aberrations, but as expected outcomes of ambition. While this environment accelerated innovation and power accumulation, it also ensured that no Sith regime could remain stable indefinitely. Empires rose quickly, fueled by certainty and force, and collapsed just as rapidly under the weight of internal rivalry. From the Jedi perspective, the Sith had become a cautionary tale. It's proof that emotional engagement with the Force led inexorably to ruin. From the Sith perspective, the Jedi had become relics, clinging to a philosophy that denied reality's harsher truths. Both interpretations were incomplete, and both would shape centuries of conflict to come. The first schism, then, was not merely a division between light and dark, as later generations would simplistically frame it. It was a divergence in how meaning itself was constructed. One side sought harmony through limitation, the other sought transcendence through confrontation. Neither path was free of cost. By the time the Sith Order began to see itself as distinct and enduring, the possibility of reunion had faded into abstraction. What remained was legacy. The Jedi would refine their codes, narrowing their focus in response to perceived threat. The Sith would expand outward, building identities rooted in conquest and survival. The galaxy, vast and patient, absorbed both traditions without judgment. And in the shadows of distant worlds, the Sith began to imagine something larger than exile, something beyond survival. They began to imagine rule. The transformation from exile to empire did not occur through declaration. It unfolded slowly, shaped by environment as much as ideology. The red world that had drawn the dark exiles to its surface offered no comfort and little mercy. Its skies were heavy with dust, its terrain scarred by ancient conflict, and its very atmosphere carried a resonance within the Force that amplified intensity while punishing hesitation. Survival on this world demanded adaptation, and adaptation in time became doctrine. The native Sith species were not merely Force-sensitive, they were Force-shaped. Their physical forms, marked by crimson skin and ritualistic adornment, reflected a culture that viewed power as inheritance rather than accident. Strength was lineage. Authority was proven through domination. Even spiritual belief was hierarchical, was centered on ancestral spirits who demanded reverence and sacrifice in equal measure. To the exiles, this was not barbarism, it was clarity. Where the Jedi had abstracted the Force into philosophy, the Sith had embedded it into daily life. The early interactions between the exiles and the Sith were characterized by cautious observation rather than immediate integration. The exiles recognized that raw power, untempered by discipline, often collapsed inward. The Sith recognized that knowledge without ambition stagnated. Over generations, these mutual observations produced a synthesis neither group could have achieved alone. The exiles brought structure. The Sith brought purpose. Together, they forged something new. This fusion gave rise to what history would later call the Sith Empire, though at its inception, it was less a unified state than a constellation of dominions bound by shared belief. Authority flowed from those who demonstrated mastery of both force and fear. Ritual became law. Conquest became theology. The Sith Lords who emerged from this environment were not merely rulers. They were embodiments of an idea that power, once attained, justified its own existence. Central to this belief was the reinterpretation of conflict. Where earlier Sith thinkers had viewed struggle as a means of self-refinement, the Lords of the Red World elevated it to cosmic necessity. Conflict was no longer an unfortunate reality to be endured, but the engine through which evolution itself advanced. Peace, in this framework, was decay. Stability was stagnation. Only through constant pressure could the strong be separated from the weak. As this worldview reshaped governance, Sith society organized itself into rigid hierarchies, enforced through ritualized violence and political maneuvering. Titles were earned, challenged, and lost with regularity. Betrayal was not punished as a crime, but evaluated as a tactic. Failure, when exposed, carried consequences, not because it was immoral, but because it revealed inadequacy. The Sith did not believe in equality, nor did they pretend to. Inequality, they argued, was evidence of natural order. The Force responded accordingly. On this world, dark side practices intensified. Alchemy reshaped flesh and stone alike. Architecture was carved not merely to shelter, but to intimidate, with tombs and temples aligned to amplify fear and reverence. Even death was repurposed. The Sith Lords prepared elaborate burial sites designed to anchor their presence within the Force, ensuring that their influence would persist long after their physical forms decayed. It was during this era that the Sith began to see themselves as eternal, not individually, but collectively. The Order was no longer a temporary response to exile. It was destiny made manifest. Sith texts from this period speak often of inevitability, of a future in which the galaxy would recognize the futility of resistance and accept rule by those strong enough to impose coherence upon chaos. This belief was not born of optimism, but of patience. The Sith had learned to think in centuries. Among the most significant figures of this era was Marka Ragnos, whose reign came to symbolize the height of early Sith power. His authority was maintained not solely through fear, but through balance of ambition among rivals. Ragnos understood that unchecked conflict could destroy the Order as easily as external threat. He permitted competition, but controlled its timing. In doing so, he prolonged stability without erasing tension. Under his rule, the Sith Empire expanded beyond its homeworld, launching campaigns into surrounding systems. These conquests were not driven by necessity. They were exercises in validation. Each victory reinforced the Sith belief that the Force favored those who seized it without hesitation. Each subjugated world became proof that the Jedi's philosophy of restraint was incompatible with galactic reality. Yet expansion brought exposure. As Sith fleets ventured farther from their origin, they encountered civilizations that resisted not merely through arms, but through ideology. Some had Force traditions of their own. Others rejected Sith rule outright, viewing it as tyranny rather than order. Suppressing these cultures required increasingly complex strategies. The Sith adapted by refining manipulation alongside conquest, learning that domination could be achieved as effectively through belief as through force. This evolution marked a subtle shift. Power was no longer expressed only through visible strength. It began to operate through influence, fear of absence as much as fear of presence. Sith Lords cultivated reputations that preceded them, leveraging myth as a weapon. The line between ruler and symbol blurred. To defy a Sith Lord was not merely to challenge an individual, but to reject the inevitability they represented. After Ragnos's death, this balance collapsed. His absence unleashed ambitions long restrained. Two prominent figures, each claiming ideological legitimacy, drew the Empire into internal conflict. One of these was Naga Sadow, but the proponent of aggressive expansion, who believed that survival depended on overwhelming force applied without delay. To him, secrecy was weakness, and patience an excuse for inaction. The galaxy, he argued, must be shown the Sith's supremacy in undeniable terms. This period of rivalry weakened the Empire at a critical moment. While Sith Lords contested dominance among themselves, the Jedi became increasingly aware of the threat they represented. What had once been distant rumors hardened into intelligence. The Jedi Order, long cautious to the point of inertia, now faced an adversary shaped by centuries of philosophical divergence and hardened by conquest. The conflict that followed would no longer be ideological alone. The Lords of the Red World had forged an empire powerful, ruthless, and deeply convinced of its own necessity. And yet within that conviction lay fragility. Their belief in strength ensured constant testing, but offered little protection against collective failure. Unity, once broken, proved difficult to restore. As Sith fleets prepared for open war with the Jedi, The galaxy stood on the edge of a conflict that would define both orders for generations. The Sith believed themselves ready, tempered by struggle, and guided by destiny. The Jedi believed themselves obligated, custodians of a balance now openly threatened. Neither fully understood the cost. The Age of Shadows had ended. The Age of Fire was about to begin. When the Sith finally turned their gaze outward in earnest, the galaxy they encountered was neither naive nor unprepared. Civilizations had risen and fallen without their influence, and the Jedi, though often cautious to the point of hesitation, were not ignorant of the patterns that accompanied concentrated power. What changed in this era was scale. The Sith no longer tested the galaxy at its edges. They pressed against its core. The conflict that followed is remembered less as a single war than as a sustained collision between two incompatible visions of order. At the heart of the struggle stood the Galactic Republic, a sprawling political body whose strength lay in cooperation rather than domination. The Republic was imperfect, slow to respond, and frequently divided by internal interests, while yet it endured because it did not demand uniformity. The Sith, accustomed to hierarchy enforced by fear, found this resilience difficult to comprehend. To them, such a system should have collapsed under its own contradictions. It did not. The opening movements of the conflict favored the Sith. Their fleets moved with purpose, driven by commanders who interpreted hesitation as weakness and resistance as invitation. Worlds fell not always because they were overwhelmed, but because they were unprepared for an enemy unconcerned with negotiation. Sith Lords did not seek legitimacy through consent. They sought compliance through inevitability. Yet fire, once unleashed, has a tendency to spread beyond intention. As Sith influence expanded, so too did internal division. The rivalries that had once been contained within ritual and controlled confrontation now played out across entire systems. Resources were hoarded. Victories were claimed prematurely. The belief that conflict refined strength was tested against the reality that too much conflict eroded cohesion. The Sith Empire, powerful though it was, began to fracture along lines of ambition. The Jedi response was slow, but deliberate. Where the Sith sought decisive annihilation, the Jedi emphasized containment. They focused on protecting key systems, evacuating vulnerable populations, and disrupting Sith command structures, rather than pursuing glory in battle. This approach frustrated many within the Republic, who demanded swift resolution, yet it reflected a deeper understanding of the Sith philosophy. The Jedi recognized that prolonged resistance, rather than outright victory, could destabilize an enemy that thrived on momentum. Among the Sith leadership, this resistance provoked disagreement. One faction, led by the warlord Naga Sadow, argued that the Jedi's caution proved the necessity of overwhelming force. Sadow believed that terror, applied visibly and repeatedly, would shatter the Republic's will. He embraced spectacle as strategy, using illusions and exaggerated displays of power to project an image of invincibility. To him, fear was not merely a weapon, but a language the galaxy understood instinctively. Opposing him was Ludo Kresh, whose philosophy reflected an older Sith pragmatism. Kresh favored consolidation over expansion, arguing that internal unity mattered more than rapid conquest. He understood that an empire stretched too thin invited collapse, and the rivalry between these two figures did more than divide leadership. It exposed a fundamental flaw in Sith governance. There existed no mechanism to resolve disagreement without force. When the Jedi and Republic finally struck back with coordination and resolve, the consequences were severe. Key Sith strongholds fell. Supply lines were disrupted. Alliances forged through fear dissolved when fear was no longer sufficient. In the midst of this chaos, the Sith discovered that the Force itself did not guarantee victory. Power amplified intent, but it could not compensate for strategic incoherence. The Jedi, working in concert, neutralized individual Sith Lords whose personal dominance had masked systemic weakness. One of the most consequential engagements of this era unfolded near the Republic world of Empress Teta, where Sith forces underestimated local resistance and Jedi coordination. The battle did not end the war, but it marked a turning point. For the first time, the Sith were forced to retreat, not due to betrayal, but due to unified opposition. The myth of their inevitability cracked. In response, Sith tactics grew more desperate. Weapons once considered impractical were deployed without restraint. Entire populations were sacrificed to fuel alchemical experiments. Ancient rituals were resurrected in hopes of reversing momentum. These acts, while devastating, accelerated the Sith's decline. Each escalation alienated potential allies and reinforced the Jedi narrative that the Sith were not bearers of order, but agents of destruction. The Jedi, too, paid a price. Exposure to prolonged conflict hardened them. Councils once dedicated to meditation and diplomacy now debated military doctrine. Young initiates were trained not only in balance, but in battle. While the Jedi maintained their philosophical core, the war forced compromises that would echo into later centuries. Detachment became more rigid. Emotion, already viewed with suspicion, it was increasingly associated with danger. As the conflict drew toward its conclusion, neither side emerged unscarred. The Sith Empire, once unified by belief and ambition, lay fractured. Its greatest lords were dead or displaced. Its territories were lost or isolated. The Jedi and Republic, though victorious, emerged cautious and weary, having glimpsed the cost of absolute opposition. The galaxy itself bore the marks of fire and ruin. Worlds reshaped not by ideology, but by consequence. In Sith histories, this era is remembered not as defeat, but as proof. Proof that power alone was insufficient. Proof that visibility invited resistance. Proof that conquest, when pursued without patience, sowed the seeds of annihilation. For the Jedi, it was a warning that balance, once disrupted, demanded vigilance beyond philosophy, and that restraint did not guarantee safety, only responsibility. The embers of the Sith Empire cooled, but they did not extinguish. In the ruins of temples and the silence of abandoned worlds, knowledge endured. The Sith had lost their empire, but not their conviction. They withdrew into shadow, carrying with them lessons learned through fire. The age of open dominion had failed. What followed would be quieter and far more dangerous. Defeat, when it arrives slowly, rarely announces itself. It settles instead into routine, into altered expectations, into the quiet recognition that what once seemed inevitable has become improbable. For the Sith, the centuries following the collapse of their ancient empires were defined not by a single catastrophic loss, but by accumulation, loss of territory, loss of coherence, loss of certainty. What remained was belief, stripped of infrastructure and tested by isolation. In Jedi archives, this period is often summarized as resolution. The Sith threat, neutralized. The dark side, contained. Such conclusions, while comforting, were incomplete. They mistook absence for extinction and silence for surrender. The Sith did not vanish. They contracted. Scattered remnants withdrew into remote systems, uncharted regions, and forgotten strongholds. Some clung to ruined temples whose stones still resonated faintly with dark rituals. Others abandoned physical sanctuaries altogether, carrying knowledge in memory rather than monument. This dispersal was not coordinated. There was no central authority to guide it. Each surviving Sith Lord interpreted survival through their own philosophy, and this divergence proved corrosive. Without empire, hierarchy lost clarity. Titles persisted, but their meaning diluted. Claims to legitimacy multiplied, each supported by fragmentary texts or tenuous lineage. Where once power had been tested against external resistance, it now turned inward. Rivalries intensified. Alliances became provisional. The Sith belief that conflict refined strength offered no protection against collective erosion. The Order, long sustained by opposition to the Jedi, struggled to define itself without a visible enemy. Some Sith sought reconciliation with their past. They revisited ancient doctrines, searching for the moment when ambition had overreached discipline. These figures argued that the failure of the empires was not proof of Jedi superiority, but of Sith impatience. To them, the lesson was not abandonment of conquest, but delay. Others rejected introspection entirely, doubling down on domination in miniature. They ruled isolated worlds as tyrants, mistaking local control for resurgence. Both paths led to stagnation. The Jedi, observing only fragments of this decline, interpreted it as validation of their philosophy. They reinforced prohibitions, tightened oversight, and redoubled efforts to prevent the emergence of new dark traditions. In doing so, they inadvertently contributed to the Sith's invisibility. Sith teachings were no longer transmitted openly. They became encoded, ritualized, and selective. Knowledge passed not through institutions, but through whispered instruction and lethal trial. This era produced what Sith texts later described as the Age of Pretenders. Numerous individuals claimed the mantle of Dark Lord, yet few possessed the breadth of understanding required to sustain it. Power was often accumulated rapidly and lost just as quickly. Betrayal occurred not as culmination, but as routine. Apprentices murdered masters without inheriting their discipline. Masters hoarded secrets so obsessively that their deaths erased entire lines of knowledge. The Sith Order, once expansive, began to cannibalize itself. Ironically, it was this self-destruction that preserved it, as by eliminating the weak, the reckless, and the impatient, the The Sith reduced themselves to a handful of survivors capable of enduring isolation without losing purpose. These figures learned to value obscurity as protection. Visibility, they concluded, had invited annihilation. Silence, cultivated carefully, might ensure survival. The Jedi, for their part, grew increasingly confident. With no unified Sith adversary to oppose them, they returned to mediation, scholarship, and internal refinement. The memory of open war faded into abstraction, preserved in holocrons and cautionary lectures rather than lived experience. Over time, vigilance softened into assumption. The Sith, it was believed, were a problem of the past. This assumption shaped Jedi training profoundly. Emotion, already viewed with suspicion, became synonymous with risk. The dark side was taught not as an alternative philosophy, but as a pathology. Curiosity about it was discouraged. Study replaced understanding. The Jedi did not so much defeat the Sith as decide they were no longer worth considering. In the shadows, the Sith watched and learned. They observed how institutions behaved when unchallenged, how bureaucracies expanded, how ideals hardened into dogma. The long defeat taught the Sith a lesson more valuable than any conquest. Endurance did not require dominance. It required adaptation. Power, when hidden, could accumulate without resistance. Among the Sith who survived this era, a consensus slowly emerged, though it was never formalized. The old ways had failed. Empires invited collapse. Numbers bred rivalry. Visibility provoked unity among enemies. If the Sith were to return, it would not be as an army, but as an idea embedded within the structures of their opposition. This realization did not yet produce a solution. The Sith remained divided, diminished, and often self-destructive. But beneath the chaos, a refinement was underway. The excesses of the past were being stripped away. What endured was will, sharpened by loss and clarified by time. The Sith no longer dreamed of ruling immediately. They dreamed of ruling inevitably. By the end of the long defeat, the galaxy believed the Sith extinct. This belief was their greatest victory. What followed would not resemble the empires of old. It would be smaller, colder, and infinitely more precise. And it would begin not with conquest, but with a single, ruthless idea. The idea that would end the long defeat did not arise from triumph, nor from revelation granted by the Force. It emerged instead from exhaustion, from the accumulated failures of centuries, from the quiet recognition that every attempt to preserve the Sith through numbers had resulted in dilution, fragmentation, and eventual collapse. Where others had sought to restore the old empires, one Sith Lord chose to dismantle the Order itself. His name was Darth Bane, and his legacy would outlast every throne that had come before him. Bane came of age in a time when the Sith were plentiful, but weak. They existed as armies, cults, and competing dominions, each claiming legitimacy, each repeating the same errors under new banners. They fought the Jedi openly once more. He convinced that sheer force of numbers would compensate for the absence of discipline. It did not. The Jedi adapted, as they always had, and Sith casualties mounted, not because the dark side had failed them, but because they had failed it. Bane observed this pattern with growing clarity. To him, the Sith's greatest weakness was not the Jedi, but themselves. The dark side rewarded ambition, yet the Sith allowed ambition to disperse across too many claimants. Power was shared, negotiated, compromised. In attempting to build strength collectively, the Sith had recreated the very egalitarian tendencies they despised in the Republic. Their philosophy had been betrayed by their structure. The solution Bane envisioned was radical in its simplicity. There would be no Sith Order in the traditional sense, no councils, and no armies of dark acolytes vying for dominance. There would be only two. One master, embodying the accumulated knowledge and power of the dark side. One apprentice, driven by ambition, hunger, and the certainty that the master must one day fall. This was not compromise. It was concentration. Bane understood that power. When divided, weakened. When focused, it intensified. By limiting the Sith to two at any given time, he ensured that the dark side would be cultivated without dilution and tested without mercy. The master would teach everything, knowing that secrecy invited stagnation. The apprentice would learn everything, knowing that patience was the only path to succession. Betrayal, once a flaw, became the system's engine. In this model, conflict did not erupt chaotically across factions. It was internalized, contained. It delayed until the moment it could no longer be avoided. When the apprentice struck, it would be because they had surpassed the master, not because they were impatient or reckless. If the apprentice failed, they were unworthy. If they succeeded, the Sith grew stronger. To implement this vision, Bane destroyed what remained of the old Sith. The act was not framed as genocide, but as correction. Those who clung to outdated models of power were eliminated not out of cruelty, but necessity. Bane believed that the Sith could not evolve so long as they remained burdened by tradition, misunderstood as continuity. In ending them, he preserved what he considered the true essence of the dark side. The Jedi, witnessing the apparent annihilation of the Sith, concluded the threat was finally resolved. This misinterpretation was essential, or Bane retreated into secrecy, taking an apprentice and vanishing from the historical record. From this point onward, Sith history ceased to be public. It became genealogical rather than institutional, passed from master to apprentice like a lineage of shadows. Each generation refined techniques, deepened understanding, and erased traces of its existence. The rule of two demanded patience above all else. Masters trained apprentices not merely in the use of the Force, but in restraint, deception, and endurance. Sith no longer sought confrontation with the Jedi. They studied them, observed their habits, identified their blind spots. The goal was no longer victory in battle, but victory in time. Over centuries, this approach transformed the Sith. They became scholars of systems rather than conquerors of worlds. They learned the mechanics of politics, finance, and belief. They understood that institutions rot not when attacked, but when subtly guided toward their own excesses. The dark side, once expressed through fire and spectacle, became quiet, precise, and almost invisible. Each Sith pair believed itself closer to culmination than the last. Yet the rule of two was not without risk. A master who failed to inspire ambition risked stagnation. An apprentice who struck too early risked annihilation. The system tolerated no error. Entire lines ended when miscalculation occurred. Knowledge was lost and rediscovered, refined and reinterpreted. The Sith endured not because they were numerous, but because they were adaptable. The Jedi, meanwhile, grew increasingly abstracted from the possibility of their return. Without visible enemies, the Order turned inward. Doctrine hardened. The dark side was treated as a theoretical danger rather than an active philosophy. The rule of two ensured that the Sith would never again present a target large enough to unite their enemies against them. By the end of this era, the Sith had achieved what no empire ever had. They were invisible, patient, and fully embedded in the long arc of history. Their power was no longer measured in fleets or territories, but in inevitability. The galaxy moved, slowly and unknowingly, along paths they had begun to shape generations earlier. The fire had been extinguished. In its place remained a single, enduring ember carried forward in silence, waiting not for opportunity, but for alignment. The Sith had learned how to wait. Silence, when sustained over generations, reshapes perception. What begins as caution becomes assumption, and assumption, over time, hardens into belief. For nearly a millennium following the implementation of the rule of two, the Sith existed only as absence. No banners were raised in their name. No fleets crossed hyperspace bearing their insignia. No holocrons surfaced to provoke alarm. To the galaxy at large, and to the Jedi in particular, the Sith had passed into myth. This silence was not emptiness. It was labor. Under the rule of two, each Sith master and apprentice pair inherited not only knowledge, but unfinished intention. They did not seek to overturn the galaxy within a single lifetime. Their work was incremental, often indistinguishable from coincidence. Influence replaced invasion. Subtlety replaced spectacle. Where ancient Sith had burned brightly and briefly, these successors dimmed their presence until it could no longer be isolated. The primary lesson of the long defeat had been internalized. Open conflict united enemies. Visibility created resistance. Power, to endure, had to be mistaken for normality. The Sith no longer wished to rule over the galaxy from thrones of obsidian. They sought to rule through the galaxy's own mechanisms, guiding its institutions toward outcomes that appeared organic, even inevitable. To do this, they studied systems rather than worlds. The Sith came to understand that the greatest engines of galactic influence were not armies, but bureaucracy, commerce, and law. The Galactic Republic, vast and decentralized, proved an ideal subject. Its strength lay in representation and debate, but these same qualities made it vulnerable to stagnation. Decisions required consensus. Action required procedure. Responsibility dispersed until it could no longer be clearly assigned. The Sith did not seek to dismantle the Republic. They nurtured its excesses. Through carefully chosen intermediaries, they influenced trade routes, financial dependencies, and political incentives. They encouraged corruption, not by introducing it, but by allowing it to flourish unchecked. Worlds grew wealthy, then complacent. Senators learned that procedure could be weaponized, delay could be profitable, and moral clarity could be postponed indefinitely in the name of stability. None of this required overt dark side intervention. In fact, the Sith avoided it whenever possible. The Force, powerful as it was, left traces, where patterns emerged around those who relied on it too openly. Instead, Sith influence operated through human behavior, exploiting fear, greed, and ambition already present within galactic society. The dark side was not imposed. It was invited. The Jedi, tasked with maintaining balance, found themselves increasingly out of alignment with the galaxy they served. As guardians of peace, they were drawn into administrative roles, serving as investigators, mediators, and ceremonial representatives of moral authority. Their presence reassured, but it also distanced them from lived experience. The Jedi Temple, centered on worlds such as Coruscant, became a symbol of stability rather than adaptability. Surrounded by political power, the Jedi grew accustomed to proximity without influence. The Sith watched this with careful patience, and they noted how Jedi training emphasized detachment more rigidly with each generation. Emotion, already suspect, became equated with vulnerability. This made the Jedi disciplined, but predictable. They sensed disturbances in the Force, but interpreted them through established frameworks. Subtle manipulation, especially when rooted in political process rather than violence, fell outside their expectations. Over time, the Jedi began to mistake equilibrium for balance. The Force, quiet on the surface, appeared undisturbed. Large-scale conflict was rare. The Republic endured. To many within the Order, this was evidence of success. The absence of the Sith confirmed the effectiveness of vigilance. The possibility that vigilance itself had grown narrow was rarely entertained. Meanwhile, the Sith refined succession. Each master selected an apprentice not merely for power, but for temperament. Patience became as valued as ambition. Apprentices were taught to think in generational terms, to view personal achievement as secondary to continuity. The dark side, once a conduit for immediate dominance, became a discipline of long-term control. Failures still occurred. Some Sith revealed themselves prematurely, succumbing to arrogance or frustration. These lines ended quietly, erased not by the Jedi, but by their own misjudgment. Other lines adapted, learning from absence as much as from survival. Over centuries, the Sith approach grew colder, more analytical, less theatrical. By the end of this long silence, the galaxy had changed. The Republic was vast, but brittle. Its systems were interconnected to the point that disruption in one sector rippled outward unpredictably. Trust in institutions persisted, but belief in ideals had thinned. The Jedi were respected, but increasingly ceremonial, invoked more often as symbols than as agents of decisive change. This was not decay in the dramatic sense. It was erosion. The Sith understood that when collapse finally came, it would not feel like invasion. It would feel like inevitability. But the Republic would fracture under pressures it could no longer reconcile. The Jedi would be constrained by codes designed for a simpler age. And when the Sith finally acted openly again, it would not be to announce their return, but to formalize a transformation already complete. 1,000 years of silence had not weakened the Sith. It had perfected them. The galaxy, lulled by stability and absence, stood unguarded not by ignorance, but by certainty. And certainty, the Sith knew, was the most fragile defense of all. When the Sith chose to move again, they did so without spectacle, without proclamation, and without rupture. The age of secrecy had taught them that power announced is power contested. What they required now was alignment of circumstance, of institutions, and of perception. The culmination of 1,000 years of silence would not resemble a conquest. It would resemble governance. This era is remembered as phantom, not because it lacked substance, but because its substance was deliberately misattributed. The Sith Master who presided over the opening movements of this final design understood that the galaxy could no longer be reshaped by force alone. The Republic was too vast, too entangled in its own procedures to be seized outright. Instead, it would be guided. Pressures would be applied where they already existed. Fault lines would be widened until collapse appeared self-generated. This master was Darth Plagueis, a figure remembered less for action than for inquiry. Plagueis approached the dark side as a system to be understood rather than an instinct to be indulged. He studied life itself, probing the Force not merely as a source of power, but as a mechanism of persistence. His interests lay in longevity, in influence that outlived individuals, in control exercised so subtly it escaped recognition. Plagueis believed that the Sith had failed in the past because they mistook domination for mastery. To rule openly invited resistance. To rule indirectly invited dependence. Under his guidance, Sith strategy narrowed its focus to a single institution whose stability governed the fate of countless systems, the Republic Senate. Control of this body did not require fear. It required trust, procedure, and the slow normalization of compromise. To enact this strategy, Plagueis required an apprentice capable of moving comfortably within public life. This apprentice would need ambition tempered by restraint, charisma supported by calculation, and an intuitive understanding of how ideals erode when burdened by responsibility. In time, Plagueis found such a figure in Darth Sidious, born into a world defined by tradition, ceremony, and political subtlety. Sidious learned quickly. He absorbed Sith teachings not as dogma, but as tools. Where earlier Sith had viewed deception as a tactic, he elevated it to identity. He understood that visibility could be weaponized, that appearing unthreatening could disarm scrutiny more effectively than intimidation. And he did not seek to overthrow the Republic. He sought to embody it. Sidious entered galactic politics not as an outsider, but as a servant. Representing the interests of Naboo, he cultivated a reputation for patience, humility, and procedural respect. These qualities, unremarkable in isolation, proved invaluable within a Senate accustomed to excess. Where others postured, Sidious listened. Where others demanded, he deferred. Influence accumulated not through assertion, but through reliability. Meanwhile, crises were engineered with careful restraint. Conflicts emerged that appeared regional, manageable, and morally ambiguous. Trade disputes escalated. Corporate interests asserted autonomy. Systems grew dissatisfied with Republic oversight, while remaining dependent on its protection. Each incident justified incremental expansion of authority. temporary measures framed as necessary responses to complexity. The Jedi observed these developments without alarm. They sensed tension, but not disturbance. The dark side, diffused through bureaucracy and policy, left no singular imprint. The Jedi had been trained to recognize corruption in individuals, not in processes. As long as the Republic functioned, they believed balance endured. Plagueis, watching from the periphery, ensured that the Sith remained unchallenged. He maintained distance from public affairs, allowing Sidious to rise while preserving the rule of two's essential secrecy. Their partnership was not one of sentiment, but of mutual utility. The master provided vision. The apprentice provided execution. Together, they refined a model of power that required neither temples nor armies. When Plagueis was eventually removed, it was not through rebellion against the system, but through its fulfillment. Sidious, now unencumbered, inherited not only Sith knowledge, but an architecture of influence already embedded within the Republic's highest structures. The transition was invisible. No alarm sounded. No enemies rallied. The Sith line continued, uninterrupted and stronger for its discretion. By this stage, the Republic's vulnerabilities were no longer theoretical. Its reliance on procedure slowed response. Its emphasis on neutrality blurred moral clarity. Its scale rendered accountability diffuse. Sidious did not create these conditions. He revealed them, applying pressure until they justified his solutions. The Senate, seeking stability, granted authority. The populace, seeking order, accepted reassurance. The Jedi, as seeking balance, offered support. The Sith had returned not as conquerors, but as caretakers. This was the phantom ascendancy, a rise so gradual it felt like continuity, so legal it felt legitimate, and so calm it escaped fear. The galaxy did not notice the hand guiding events because it recognized the form that hand assumed. Power, at last, had learned how to wear the mask of peace. What remained was not the struggle to gain control, but the question of how long control could be maintained once openly declared. The final movement approached not with urgency, but with administrative certainty. The Sith no longer needed to hide. They had become indispensable. Collapse, when engineered patiently, does not resemble catastrophe. It unfolds instead as reclassification. Powers once considered, temporary, become permanent. Measures once justified as exceptions are absorbed into routine. By the time the transformation is complete, the language used to describe it has shifted so gradually that resistance feels not only impractical, but unreasonable. This was the moment toward which the Sith had been guiding the galaxy for generations. The Republic, strained by conflict and paralyzed by its own mechanisms, had reached a threshold where stability required centralization. Authority, once distributed to prevent tyranny, was now consolidated to prevent chaos. Each decision followed logically from the last. Each concession appeared reversible. Together, they formed a structure no longer capable of returning to its original shape. The Jedi Order, long regarded as guardians of balance, found themselves bound by the very system they had helped preserve. Their role within the Republic had evolved from independent mediators to institutional agents. They were consulted, deployed, and relied upon, yet increasingly constrained by political necessity. As generals within a galactic conflict, They were asked to lead armies they did not command and enforce peace through means that contradicted their foundational principles. This tension did not manifest as rebellion. It manifested as compliance tempered by doubt. The Sith understood this pressure intimately. Balance, as the Jedi defined it, required clarity of perception and freedom of action. By embedding the Jedi within a bureaucratic hierarchy, yet the Sith ensured both would erode. Decisions were delayed. Authority was questioned. Responsibility diffused. The Jedi sensed unease within the Force, but its source appeared systemic rather than personal. There was no singular darkness to confront, no identifiable enemy to oppose. The final deception lay in proximity. The Sith no longer operated at the edges of perception. They stood openly at the center of galactic governance, their intentions obscured not by shadow, but by legitimacy. When the Jedi grew concerned, they did so cautiously, aware that accusation without proof risked undermining public trust. The very virtues that had sustained them for centuries now restricted their response. At the heart of this convergence stood Anakin Skywalker, a figure whose life embodied the unresolved contradictions of the Jedi philosophy. From his earliest training, Anakin had been defined by intensity. His connection to the Force was profound, immediate, and emotionally charged. The Jedi, recognizing both his potential and his instability, attempted to contain him through discipline rather than understanding. Fear of loss, attachment, and anger were addressed as flaws to be corrected, not signals to be interpreted. In doing so, they isolated him at the moment when guidance mattered most. The Sith required no persuasion beyond recognition. They did not invent Anakin's fear. They acknowledged it. They did not create his anger. They gave it context. Where the Jedi offered restraint, the Sith offered agency. Where the Jedi demanded surrender, the Sith promised control. This was not seduction through rhetoric, but alignment through validation. As the turning point did not arrive as betrayal in the conventional sense, it arrived as resolution. Faced with a choice between adherence to an order that denied his emotional reality and allegiance to a philosophy that framed that reality as strength, Anakin chose coherence. In doing so, he did not believe he was embracing darkness. He believed he was rejecting hypocrisy. The Sith did not ask him to destroy the Jedi. They asked him to transcend them. What followed has often been described as sudden. In truth, it was procedural. With authority consolidated and loyalty formalized, a single directive reclassified the Jedi from protectors to threats. No debate followed. No trial convened. The language of security replaced the language of trust. Those who carried out the directive did so not as villains, but as soldiers following lawful command. The efficiency of the outcome reflected years of preparation, not momentary cruelty. The Jedi were not defeated in battle. They were removed from relevance. Temples fell, not because they were overrun, but because they were isolated. Masters perished, not because they were unskilled, but because they were unprepared for betrayal by the system they served. The Force, turbulent and grieving, echoed with confusion rather than resistance. Balance did not shatter in a single moment. It slipped, quietly, beyond reach. In the aftermath, the galaxy did not erupt into chaos. It exhaled. war ended. Uncertainty narrowed. Authority clarified. For many worlds, life improved in tangible ways. Piracy diminished. Trade stabilized. Order, imposed firmly and without apology, replaced negotiation. As the cost of this order was abstract, distant, and easily deferred, the Sith revealed themselves not through declaration, but through permanence. What had once been temporary measures solidified into doctrine. Emergency powers became standard governance. Surveillance normalized. Dissent reframed as disruption. The galaxy adjusted, not because it approved, but because adaptation was easier than resistance. For the Jedi, those few who survived, balance became memory. They retreated into obscurity, forced to reconsider doctrines that had failed not through malice, but through rigidity. The Force, vast and impartial, endured their absence without correction. It did not intervene, it waited. The fall of balance was not the triumph of darkness over light. It was the triumph of inevitability over principle. Yet the Sith had not destroyed the Jedi by opposing them directly. They had allowed the Jedi to become incompatible with the world they protected. In doing so, they proved a final, devastating thesis: that an order unwilling to evolve would eventually be rendered obsolete by those who did. The galaxy entered a new era not with thunder, but with paperwork. And in that quiet transition, the Sith achieved what generations of war had failed to secure. An empire, once declared, is often mistaken for an endpoint. In truth, it is a condition, sustained not by proclamation, but by repetition. Laws enforced daily. Narratives reinforced quietly. Habits normalized until alternatives feel impractical. The Sith understood this more clearly than any rulers before them. Their victory did not lie in the fall of the Jedi or the dissolution of the Republic, but in the construction of a reality that no longer required justification. The Empire emerged not as rupture, but as inheritance. Its institutions were not built from nothing. They were reclassified remnants of the old order, repurposed and streamlined. Ministries changed names. Authorities expanded jurisdiction. What had once been emergency structures hardened into permanence. To the galaxy's citizens, as the transition felt administrative rather than ideological. Life continued. Trade flowed. Security improved in visible, measurable ways. At the center of this system stood Galactic Empire, not as an aberration, but as culmination. The Sith philosophy that underpinned it was no longer framed as doctrine. It did not need to be. The Empire embodied Sith principles without naming them. Hierarchy replaced deliberation. Obedience replaced consensus. Order replaced balance. The dark side no longer announced itself through ritual or conquest. It manifested through efficiency. Fear, once theatrical, became ambient. Citizens did not need to witness brutality to understand its possibility. The knowledge that force could be applied at any moment and without appeal was sufficient. Compliance was achieved not through constant violence, but through its implied availability. The Sith had learned that restraint, when paired with certainty, was more sustainable than terror unbound. The Emperor, once a phantom influence, now ruled openly. Yet even in visibility, he remained obscured. The figure at the apex of the Empire presented himself as administrator rather than conqueror, custodian rather than tyrant. The language of duty replaced the language of domination. Responsibility for suffering was diffused across systems, regulations, and necessity. No single act appeared excessive. Each was defensible within context. This diffusion was intentional. The Sith had long understood that moral outrage requires focus. By fragmenting authority, the Empire prevented resistance from finding a singular target. Dissent became isolated, easily reframed as criminality rather than opposition. Rebellion, when it emerged, appeared irrational against the backdrop of apparent stability. Within this structure existed a contradiction the Sith accepted without illusion. The rule of two, preserved in secrecy even now, had always acknowledged impermanence. A master ruled knowing they would be replaced. An apprentice served knowing they would one day overthrow. The Empire, for all its scale, was never intended to be eternal. It was a mechanism, not an end state. Its purpose was to prove that the Sith worldview could reshape the galaxy entirely. In this sense, the enforcer who embodied the Empire's will, Darth Vader, was not merely an individual, but a symbol. He represented the cost of control. Strength gained through sacrifice. Identity surrendered for order. His presence reinforced the Empire's authority, not because he was seen everywhere, but because he could appear anywhere. He was the Empire's reminder that resistance, however principled, would be answered decisively. Yet even as the Empire solidified, the Sith were aware of fragility. Systems built on control require constant maintenance. Fear must be refreshed. Loyalty must be monitored. Efficiency must be preserved through suppression of unpredictability. The very qualities that made the Empire stable also made it rigid. Adaptation slowed. Innovation narrowed. Control, once absolute, demanded ever greater effort to sustain. The Sith did not view this as failure. They had never believed in static perfection. Conflict remained central, even now. If the Empire collapsed, it would do so as all Sith structures had before, under the weight of its own success. Such collapse would not negate the Sith victory. It would reaffirm their understanding of power as cyclical rather than permanent. What endured was legacy. The galaxy had been transformed. The Republic's ideals, once assumed universal, were now remembered as historical curiosities. The Jedi, once central to balance, had been rendered marginal. The Force itself flowed on, indifferent to regime, shaped only by those willing to impose will upon it. The Sith had proven their thesis. Emotion was not weakness. Control was not cruelty. Order, even when imposed, could outlast freedom. The cost was profound, but to the Sith, cost had never been disqualifying. It was merely evidence that power had been exercised. In the quiet spaces beyond imperial centers, stories persisted of lost Jedi, of resistance, of balance not yet extinguished. The Sith did not fear these stories. They had always understood that opposition was inevitable. What mattered was that opposition now emerged within a galaxy fundamentally altered by Sith design. The Empire, whether it endured or fell, had already fulfilled its purpose. The Sith no longer needed to rule forever. They had changed what rule meant.